Everybody, welcome and thank you so much for coming to what is our final workshop of the Tompkins Chamber DEI series. We are so grateful for your attendance to, not only this one, but for your participation over the last 6 months. I do want to send a huge thank you to our sponsors, Cayuga Health System, Tompkins Community Bank, Community Foundation of Tompkins County, Borg Warner, and Chemung Canal Trust Company for all of their support. I do want to let everybody know that we are recording this session, though if you are uncomfortable in any way, feel free to send me a direct message and I can ensure that, if there's any questions or anything that you have that you don't want, publicly shared at a later time, we can absolutely make that happen. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our facilitator for today's panel, George Ferrari, who is the Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Tompkins County. So take it away, George.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for taking time to be with us today for important conversations. Although this is the last workshop in this particular series, we're in the second series, I would imagine there might be future activities and commitments of the Chamber for this kind of work. And this kind of work also lends itself to the concept that it's ongoing, it's a lifelong commitment. It fits with the Community Foundation view of being in the forever business. We are always becoming more and doing more and achieving more and learning more in the DEIJ space. And I want to thank our panelists for being here with us today, who will respond to a number of questions. As you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat as well. I should also let you know, in addition to serving as CEO of your community foundation, that's made some very strong DEI commitments in our work and our mission and how we create our staff and how we allocate our resources. I'm also ex officio on the board of the Chamber and very happy the Chamber has taken a long-term commitment to these great concerns that we have and great opportunities to do better by and for each other to achieve a more beloved and thriving community. So before I turn it over to some questions from the panelists, I want to ask them to introduce themselves, but I want to set up a couple of framing concepts that I've recently heard that I thought might be interesting for your consideration. We're going to be talking about what's diversity, equity, inclusion, how we practice that, what are some of the stumbling blocks, the hurdles, the good practices that we've been committing ourselves to. But I heard this recently and I thought it was very interesting, that diversity is an undeniable fact. There's data that describes diversity. It's a given, it's a truth. And sometimes people have a difficult challenge accepting that truth or understanding that truth or considering what that truth means. But even when there are challenges to those facts, diversity remains. Diversity is increasing in our society and community. So that's one way of conceptualizing that. Inclusion is a choice. It's a commitment. It's a strategy or an activity, and that is continual as well. Equity is both an outcome and a process goal. It's a means and an end at the same time. And the impact of that goal of equity can be evaluated and improved, and we have lessons within the results of that work. I will add another term. It wasn't part of our time today, but it's a term that I've heard people talk about quite a bit, which is belonging. Belonging is a culture, a hallmark of a culture that needs intention and caretaking. And even with the best intention and caretaking, sometimes we can fall short of our goals and our desires to create and nurture belonging. That doesn't mean we're bad. It means that we're human and imperfect, and we learn from those things. So I just wanted to kind of set that out there for your consideration. For diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice, equity is an outcome, and belonging is a culture. So having said that, I will ask each panelist if you could, I will call on you if you go around and introduce yourself by name, organization affiliation, if you'd like to share one, and what your role might be within the organization. And then we've asked each panelist to respond to a couple of different questions as we begin our conversation. So as you appear on my screen, I will call you to introduce yourself, and Stacie is the first square on my screen. So Stacie.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. Stacie Mastin. I am the Vice President and HR Manager for Corporate Culture at Tompkins Community Bank.
Thank you. And Colleen.
Hi, my name is Colleen Anunu. I am a co-managing director for Gimme Coffee, which is an employee-owned co-op. I also am the head of coffee sourcing, so I do all of the sourcing from different coffee cooperatives around the world and create menus for our cafes.
Great, thank you. Meghan?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Meghan Guerra Lyons. I'm the executive director of the Downtown Ithaca Children's Center.
Welcome. My colleague here at Community Foundation, Gloria.
Good morning, everyone. I have to include the fact that today's my birthday, and I'm doing this panel on my birthday. I am Gloria Coicou. I serve as the Chief Inclusion and Community Engagement Officer at the Community Foundation of Tompkins County. And that's just code for my job begins and ends with community and with people. What does someone like me do? Advancing equity and in our community requires a unique balance of urgency and long-term commitment. And this is why I was brought onto the Community Foundation staff. I am the rookie here. I'm novice in comparison to the rest of the panel. And I'm starting my journey in this space for about a year, and I'm excited to be here.
Yes, in addition to being Gloria's birthday, yesterday was Gloria's 1-year anniversary with Community Foundation.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Nunn.
Greetings, everyone. It is a joy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As was mentioned, my name is Dr. Nunn, and I wear multiple head wraps, as you hear me oftentimes say, those of you who've heard me speak before. But the most common thread is that I am in the expertise in the business of cultivating and creating community. So serving as an associate professor at Ithaca College in Education, board president of Southside Community Center, and executive director of COMEP, a performing arts program. But some folks don't know that I also carry an LLC with my name as I zap into doing speaking and workshops with organizations. So it's a joy to engage in this exploration with you all.
Great. Thank you all panelists and thank you attendees. We'll start by asking a couple of questions. Some of them will be focused to individual panelists, but certainly it's informal. If you're not being named in the question you want in on it, please jump right on in. I want to start with a question for both Colleen and Gloria. And that is, what is your definition? It's a simple, easy question, small answers here, right? What is your definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what does it mean to you? So let's start with Gloria, and then we'll go to Colleen, and other panelists can jump in as you'd like.
Sure. So there's no such thing as easy questions for me. So I have a slide, and I have some responses that I created here. So I'm going to try to share my screen if I could. Mary, if you can let me share my screen. Thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, diversity, equity, inclusion is not just a buzzword. It's a vision and a process that must be worked on every single day. It's a relational construct that builds upon itself. DEI has so many layers and can be very different in different areas and industries. For example, DEI for me in philanthropy looks very different than DEI in hospitality. Diversity is more of a management tool. It involves things like targeting recruiting. So organizations are hiring more women, more BIPOC individuals, being very careful about tracking pay and promotion rates and providing diversity training and things like that. It's like bringing the bodies in order to count the numbers. It's kind of like tokenism by definition. And there are two main sets of characteristics that might be included. One is called surface level or demographic characteristics, such as gender, ethnicity, age, all of these great things that we know of already, sexual orientation. Then there are what some people call deeper level characteristics, such as people's personalities, their values, and the things that they are passionate about. Both sets can influence the way that people approach their work and the perspectives that they have about work and life in general. Equity, people often confuse the terms equity with equality. Equality, refers to giving everyone the same opportunities and materials. So the same treatment, everyone gets the same exact thing. Equity refers to giving everyone the resources and opportunities based on their individual circumstances and their individual needs. This means that equity takes into account people's experiences with privilege and oppression and how those factors have influenced their lived experiences and opportunities. I feel like equity builds upon diversity. Just getting the bodies and counting the numbers, equity adds the dimension of making those actual numbers count. Once you've added these bodies, what are you going to ask yourselves? What are organizations going to ask themselves? Let's find out how these people are doing, what their environment is like, what their succession plan looks like. Are they getting the support that they need to be successful? Are women part of that? What other diversity is part of that? And so it starts to look at this whole system as a broader ecosystem. Inclusion happens when people experience feelings and belonging, yet they are very much themselves and their uniqueness is highly valued and also celebrated. They're in an environment where they can be successful and feel valued in their work. Inclusion is ultimately about how your team functions and performs based on the quality of social connections, openness, learning, agility, and depth in decision-making.
Thank you, Gloria.
Yes.
Very nicely laid out. Colleen.
Unshare my screen, I'm sorry.
You can leave it up. I mean, I don't have a slide or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, I figured that you would do an excellent job like setting the tone for the definition. So I didn't really feel the need to come at it with another definition, but rather focus on sort of what DEI means to us at GIME. Not just me personally, but us as a coffee cooperative. So many people in Ithaca have known GIME Coffee for over 2 decades, but in reality, we've only been a company as a coffee cooperative for 1 year. At the end of this month, we'll have our 1-year anniversary. And sort of the concept of DEI with centering around people's experiences, ideas, dreams, centering on marginalized folks within that sort of like realm of experience, ideas, and dreams, and creating a better workplace. So our vision as a cooperative is to elevate the experience of hospitality and production workers, which Gloria, you rightly called out, very different in hospitality, what DEI looks like in philanthropy, and still even further in production, because we are a manufacturing company as well. We want to elevate that experience of workers in order to create a higher standard of meaningful work, and ultimately let this coffee system thing thrive. So DEI is pretty much inherent to a lot of the work that we're doing here because of the need to have collective empowerment and diverse voices in order to make progress towards that goal. And so as a company, as a cooperative, we really center on this idea of we want to exist for the well-being of people. That's our employees, that's our suppliers, that are suppliers across the world in Burundi and Indonesia and in South America, Peru, Colombia, that we have close relationships with. And but also at home, in the communities that we're serving in our cafes, we want to promote this idea that, we recognize individual and collective well-being that is dependent upon many of the things that Gloria already touched on, the physical, emotional, intellectual, environmental, financial, you name it. There's a whole system of thinking about well-being of people and how access to well-being is dependent on your identity, on your race, on your gender, your age, your nationality, sexual orientation, as well as the intersections of those. They're all different: background, privilege, access to resources. You can't access the same amount of spiritual or emotional or financial well-being just focusing, in one direction. So we have to sort of use all those concepts that that Gloria had already presented in order to achieve that. So that's a really important foundation for what GIME is trying to do. And in terms of hospitality and the manufacturing business that we're in, we're not immune to the type of racial capitalism that we're a part of, and is very pervasive in our industry of hospitality, which is very much sort of rooted in this foundation of like tipped wage, like low wage, but supplemented by tips and things like that. And so we have to look really deeply and really intentionally at the sort of like white supremacy, cisgendered supremacy kind of culture that that permeates our society, and how we're going to try and move past that. So that's just a little basic, and I'm sure we could get into a little bit more about how we think about that in a little bit.
I just want to add that. Can I add?
Go.
Gloria?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. My computer is really acting up today. I feel, thank you so much for adding Colleen to that. And I totally forgot to answer the question, what does it mean to me? So true DEI, I feel like, brings about systemic change in organizations, and it requires a concerted effort. So that is an effort from not just the chief DEI person, it's from staff, it's from everybody, from the top down and from the bottom up. It's why some organizations choose to appoint chief diversity officers, chief inclusion officers like myself to implement and run DEI programs. Many organizations measure their DEI work using metrics, and we all know, such as representation and retention across different demographics. So for example, you could use data to figure out if people from minority groups are staying at an organization for how long and so forth. You can look at attrition as a data point when somebody joined in. Stop doing that. DEI work is about peeling back the layers to understand our people and what's going on in the organization. So don't look at how long people have been there or when they left, but why did they leave? Because they lack career development opportunities, because they don't have mentors, were they excluded? Did they experience bias? DEI is really, really hard work, partly because it's challenging to meet this diversity quota without slipping into tokenism, which is diversity without equity and inclusion. And we all know that's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
Totally.
Thank you, Gloria. Really important comments. It strikes me that we have people on the panel from large employers, smaller employers, mission-driven organizations, for-profit businesses, the academy. And Colleen, I never thought about Gimme Coffee before as both hospitality and manufacturing. The manufacturing piece, you really helped me to understand something I had not understood before. That was particularly interesting. I would also add that doing this work, I would argue, this is my bias, right? Identified bias from Ferrari right now, is the right thing to do. In addition, it's also the right thing to do for your business. And by business, I'm including all those types of employers, not just for-profit businesses, because data clearly show things like, it's not just retention, but what happens for the individual employee and employer while that person is there, a level of satisfaction, productivity, pride in work, connection, relationship, means that your businesses will achieve greater goals. So you're doing good and you're doing well at the same time. Did anyone else on the panel want to respond to that before we move to the next question? Okay, so the next question is both for Nia and Meghan, if you'd like. What has influenced your thinking around DEI, and what has motivated you to get involved in being an advocate for change? So we'll start with Nia.
Yes, thank you all so much. And again, so much appreciation for being here and for engaging in this dialogue. I will start by saying I find myself to be fairly protective of DEI, or these words
Yes.
right? Diversity, inclusion, equity, and how they're utilized, and even more protective of belonging. I'm like, oh, wait. And I think I say protective just because of the various ways in which folks are exploring or implementing the concepts. And I interrupt or find myself interrupting this idea of like checking a concept off of a box versus recognizing the ways in which DEI, which you'll hear me say, social consciousness work, or even humanity check-in work should be an ongoing journey. How does an organization or a community of people recognize the ways in which we can embed within the fabric of the organization this DEI or social consciousness framework? So as I mentioned, my expertise or heartbeat is around cultivating, curating community in a variety of ways, helping organizations to not only helping organizations, but modeling for organizations the ways in which we can engage in a collective self-study, right? A collective self-study, like, you know, how do we greet each other when we enter spaces? Like, what is the culture of how we even breathe around each other when we enter a space? So a lot of my work, I like to call myself, and some students, the Professor Mushy, that this is about what you think, how you feel, and what you do. Like bringing us to those three concepts on a regular basis is really what inspires the work for me. It's been mentioned that at the heartbeat of it too is not only exploring and spending time with who we are as individuals, but our collective identity, recognizing that each and every one of us brings both into every space that we enter. I bring my Dr. Nia self, I might bust out with a cartwheel, like that's a part of my personality, the energy that I bring into spaces. And my identity as a Black woman is sacred. It's significant as it relates to how I'm navigating my world and navigating society. So the question is around the influence, but also the motivation, or the motivation to be involved, the motivation to lead or to contribute to change. And I would say that my existence is my motivation in a major way. I was born involved, and honoring my humanity on a daily basis. It's a practice. It's a glorious practice. But that motivation, that influence, it comes from my parents. It comes from this foundation of educators and advocates who I witnessed and have the privilege of participating in, but I witnessed the ways in which my parents helped to create privilege in a variety of ways. So there's just that modeling has been transformative in honoring what's possible for DEI, for this social consciousness work. So those are some of my inspirations, some of the foundation of what keeps me inspired here, and the core of influence. Yeah, it's really about checking in. A humanity check-in is significant.
DEI work is relational, not transactional.
That's
right?
it.
It's the connections, right?
That who we be.
And who we are becoming as well, right?
Yes. That journey.
Thank you, Nia. So Meghan, what's influenced your thinking around DEI, and what motivated you to get involved as an advocate?
So Dr. Nia said it way more eloquently than I will. But I think about, it's that check-in with self. As a Latina, my parents also tried to create privilege. And with that, they really detached a lot from our culture. And so assimilation was big. And identity with myself, I always felt like I don't belong. And it wasn't until I taught in North Philly, I come from an education background. I taught in North Philly in a Latino neighborhood, and I finally it finally clicked. You realize what's missing sometimes when you don't acknowledge who you are and what your culture is. And so I have been kind of on this mission of learning my culture, my family. My grandfather came here as an undocumented immigrant, working jobs that nobody else wanted to do. So even now it's even resonating even more within myself. I'm married to a wonderful man who's Taiwanese, and we have a son, and we also adopted a child from foster care. And then I will also say, as somebody who was a foster parent, you have to acknowledge the differences and the cultures and the colors of everyone, because that is acknowledgement of identity and who they are. And so it was a very personal journey that I went on, thinking about what has motivated me to really get into DEI. And then, advocacy for change. I had the privilege of kind of passing throughout life, through different privileges, as, like a cisgendered white woman. And I had my daughter, who we've adopted, does not have that privilege. And so I have to be more than an advocate. I have to be the accomplice. I have to do the work so that it's better for her.
Yeah.
Wow.
Can I jump in
Powerful.
here and share?
Go for it. Go for it. Yes.
Share a slide if you all don't mind.
Yeah.
It's really, I'm enjoying this. This connection is
Good.
Is beautiful. And the slide that I want to share with you, I like to call it a credential collage. And one of the reasons why I'm jumping back in, and Meghan, thank you so much for sharing, is because I actually want to clarify and redefine privilege, because I would say that the privilege that I experienced was actually learning and having exposure to my culture right away. Like, I was raised in a culture of loving Blackness very explicitly. And some of that comes from these logos, these locations, these spaces in childhood. And that's my DEI work. I like to bring people to your childhood, reflect on what you were taught, what you had exposure to, and what that looked like, what that sounded like. I invite people to reflect very specifically too on, just your relationship and exposure to your identity. But I wanted to jump in to define the privilege that I'm speaking of. Is actually, I was taught right away that I come from greatness, but rooted in that was how then do you spread that? How then do you create culture or create what is missing? And a lot of these entities that I'm sharing with you have done that for multiple decades, including Southside, close to a century. But yeah, that redefining of privilege, I think, can be transformative for a whole bunch of us. But I thank you, Meghan, for sharing that explicit journey, because that's the DEI work too. Like you said, that self-study for each and every one of us to engage in what may seem like a confronting journey. So the work that is central to what I've been sharing for a couple of years, I like to call radical vulnerability. Radical vulnerability, right? That the authentic transformation that is possible for ourselves, our organizations, and our communities requires that we embrace this concept of radical vulnerability.
Thank you, Nia. We're also getting some shares, I think, from Gloria. I'm not exactly sure, but we'll make sure that everyone has access to all of these slides. That maybe marks me as an older person, but they're electronic PowerPoints, aren't they, Gloria? They're not even slides.
Yeah. So as Meghan and Dr. Nia brought up privilege, I always come back to this wheel of power / privilege. And it's just a really helpful visual tool to look at the power in the middle and to look at how it's branching out to what the world and what we consider marginalized. So I'll leave this slide up for a minute so people can kind of look at it, but George, you can continue to the next question.
Well, I'm sure the chamber will make sure that everyone has access to these because these are valuable resources. Meghan, when you said the phrase, don't acknowledge, you didn't acknowledge who you are, I have to tell you that as a gay man, that landed with such a colossal thud in my heart, because the lived experience of queer people is typically that. And typically, although this has changed a little, queer people are not raised by other queer people. So one thing I recently saw on Facebook that I just share with you is queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that we sacrifice authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice and increase safety. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we have created to protect ourselves. So just leave you with that experience that is part of our DEI J work. J is for justice. And when we're in the workplace, as Dr. Nia has said, we bring our whole selves. We don't leave our parts of ourselves at the door, but people are familiar with the term code switching, I'm sure, and how we're modulating and modifying who we are and what we say and how we look and how we engage in that kind of work. That takes energy. That can be exhausting. It is a survival skill, which we hope one day will not be needed, but is still needed, especially when we're looking at some of the stuff that's happening in our country around a lot of these issues. So thank you, Meghan, for bringing that up because that just really landed strongly for me.
George, would you mind putting that in the chat?
I'll see if I can do that. Yes.
Thank you.
Electronically, yes. I might need Gloria's help. I can do that. So Mary, do we have anything in that? Speaking of in the chat, do we have any questions at this point? We can. No.
There's just a comment from Matthew.
Okay.
Sometimes during these conversations, I get frustrated with the emphasis on the business case for DEI. While I recognize that there can be, often are, business benefits to DEI, it's not why this work is important. I'm curious how often you encounter this business case perspective and how you respond to it. Sorry, he didn't put a question mark at the end, so that's why I didn't recognize it. Sorry, Matthew.
Yeah. So let's cogitate upon that. We'll continue on with some of our questions. That's a very, very good point. I like trying to create as many paths as possible to our goal of diversity, equity, inclusion. Some people will travel the road that's known and familiar to me. If I try to drag them down that road and they're going to come to the same place from another road more easily and better, and I will learn from their different path, I think we lose by forcing everyone to get on the same path. So that's the way I kind of conceive of that. But our next question is for Gloria, which is similar to what you answered first, but we asked, what does DEI mean to you? This next question is on a personal level. What impact does DEI have on you? So do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. So DEI impacts me greatly because I am the minority of the minority of the minority of the minority. I belong to several identifying groups. So my DEI is multi-layered. I'll be treated differently than men because I'm woman. I'll be treated differently than other women because I'm Black. I'll be treated differently than other Black women because I'm a big girl. I may be treated differently than a big girl because I wear my hair natural. So it just kind of goes on and on and on forever. And I'm raising a young Black man in a world that demeans, dehumanizes, demoralizes, and discourages kind. And that kind of draws me into DEI. Women and people of color, and we all know this, receive, lower evaluations of competence as opposed to their counterparts, especially in senior leadership positions. The idea of success, for example, tends to be scrutinized more heavily, such that more is required to go against or dispel this doubt and be perceived as similarly competent or as smart or as qualified. I have to work twice as hard, if not 3 times as hard, for half the credit. There are some studies that show, for example, have shown that a resume that clearly has, is a white male sounding name yields a significantly higher level of interest among evaluators and recruiters than an identical resume with a female or African-American name. While the success of majority members tends to be attributed to their ability and failure to situational factors, right? So things happen. The opposite tends to be true for minority members like myself, whom success tends to be attributed to luck, or, oh, she's lucky that she got that position. Not that I'm qualified, but she's lucky. And our failures is attributed to incompetence. For example, Billy Bob makes a mistake. Oh, he's just had a rough day. And if that same mistake is made by Chantal, she's not cut out for the job, or she's not qualified, or she's incompetent, or whatever that might be. Women who voice their opinions, and we've all heard this before, or are unafraid to disagree with others, were often described as aggressive, pushy, self-interested, while the same behaviors that are engaged by a man or a white man are expected, and therefore they are likely to be identified as leader-like or strategic, or they're assertive. So these patterns result from, this automatic, unconscious thinking, and can only be combated with an intentional, very, very intentional, well thought out DEI strategic plan.
Thank you, Gloria.
Sure.
For Colleen and Nia next, what strategies do you use for developing innovative, diverse teams? Great.
Yeah, Colleen.
Unless you want to go first.
That's okay. I don't mind
Okay.
going after you.
Okay. Yeah, so this is, I think all the like the literature on it would definitely say that it starts at the head. It starts with leadership. If you're a business, that as our longtime equipment and technician here at Gimme often says, the fish starts stinking at the head. So our business model as a cooperative, it has 3 heads, but also no head. We are owned by our employees. We have a board of directors that is held accountable and responsible to our employees. And we have a management team that serves at the pleasure of the board. And then the employees are held accountable to the operational practices by management. So we have, our ownership pool, our board of directors, and our management here. So, we all sort of have to be relatively aligned on what we are trying to achieve as an organization and how we're going to get there, right? And so within that, we draw upon the diversity in many different ways. The diversity of our generally trending younger front of house staff, our more experienced management staff, and then our board is a mixture of both. So ensuring the demographic representation of our board was really important when we formed the cooperative and when we transitioned. So our board is 5 people. They're all women. 4 of them are cisgender. 1 is a transgender woman. We have Black representation. We have queer representation. We have working mother representation. We've prioritized diversity in employment status as well. So our board members work in different departments, have different pay structures, and have different levels of supervisory status as well. So it just sort of ensures that there's not one concentration of power across, for decision making. We've got governance, we've got just broad governance, specific governance, and then just general operational management. The managing directors, there's 2 of us. We're both queer, non-binary, have varying levels of physical abilities and mental abilities. And we support a management team and an employee base that is, pretty wildly diverse in terms of age and other demographics as well. We actually don't collect demographic data on our employees because we've found that, it does lead people to feel tokenized, right? So if we say we exist for the well-being of people and that, we want people to feel a sense of belonging, we don't then go around and say, like, can you check all of these boxes? Because that's not the purpose of what we're trying to do here. So building those teams can be a challenge in the type of industry that we work in, right? So between hospitality and manufacturing, as I already alluded to, it has a foundation in white supremacy culture, in class struggle. The broader coffee industry has its roots in colonial exploitation of land and labor. Specialty coffee as like a market segment that we're in is often, cafes are a symptom of broader gentrification, regulatory policies and class gatekeeping. So, we happen to, be in a position where while we mean well and we feel like this doesn't need to be that way, we can, reinforce some of these like neoliberal ideas of, progress out of poverty and like low wage work being supplemented by tips, all of that stuff. So, we really try and proactively recruit people and build teams in a way that that promotes that sort of sense of belonging and equity across. So we have very clear, transparent pay structures. We are living wage certified. We have a lot of different benefits that we offer to people. And, we're a small business and we're just over that 50 people threshold, which puts us in an incredibly awkward position where we must provide benefits, but we don't have the resources to be able to really contribute to making them very affordable, to everyone, especially with a wage structure the way that we have it across the business. So, we do try on a foundational level as being a one-year-old business. Our focus has been, let's get the house in order and then build an operational plan and a governance structure in such a way that we can invest in the particularities of employee resource groups and funding those in a way that creates a broader sense of belonging while tackling these more these systemic issues that we happen to operate in.
Thanks, Colleen. I want to invite Nia to respond, and then when you're finished with your response, I want to ask a question generated about this topic for the whole panel to respond to.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that. I'm a teacher educator, right? So at the core of my responsibilities at Ithaca College for 10 years has been preparing teachers for the world. And so the direct connection at Southside, at CMEP, they're living laboratories. The community is my classroom. And so this idea of building diverse teams is ongoing. For me, I'm able to model it, but really nurturing folks so that they can do it as well. And one of the central questions that I find myself asking future teachers, but also leaders of organizations is, why would anyone want to learn from you? Right? Like, what is it about you? What is it about the culture of this community, of this space, that people want to learn or people want to follow and be a part of the space? So it brings me back to unpacking and recognizing the individual and collective identities that we carry and bring into spaces. So are we creating teams where that's acknowledged, where that is nurtured? So knowing ourselves, but also knowing the people that we're working with, kind of like the creating a classroom culture and community, classroom management and working with teachers, right? Is know yourself, know who you're bringing into the space, but how well do you know your students and nurture their connection with one another? And I reflect on this as I'm invited to participate in a lot of stuff. Right? Oftentimes invited to serve on boards, invited to, and people will say, oh, we're working to like diversify our board or diversify our space. And yes, there is a reality to the tokenization embedded in that, but there's also the glorious beauty of representation that can transform an entire organization. But I tell you what, folks will say, oh, we have this board, you know, it's predominantly white or predominantly straight or what, you know, and I say like, well, you know, what kind of white? Like, give me more. How well can you study the culture of the environment that you're in, right? How well can you stop and think about the dynamics of how you communicate, how you dialogue, how you hear each other, how you see each other? And so it shocks people's system a little bit. They're like, when I ask that, I'm like, okay, you tell me it's all white, but what kind of white? Right? What am I dealing with? Where are you as it relates to reflecting on your identity and the culture of that space? So I think that that's one of the primary sort of strategies, is really doing that intense pause and reflective work. And I think that's important as folks get a little confused or even push back on the idea of affinity groups and the sacredcy that is possible from the opportunity for us to be able to zap into a collective experience that is common, right? And the benefits that brings as we are just navigating society with everyone. There is a reality to which we need to check in with ourselves and one another. So your organizations are folks that are pushing for mentoring and blending and working with each other is great. And respecting the value and sacredcy of coming together based on our social commonalities. So for an organization or community to acknowledge that precious connection, I think would help to strengthen retention and the ways in which people can create a home place in a workplace. And that just changes the vibe that can shift and transform what's possible. So yeah, that's just one piece to share. I'm sure there are other things that I could contribute in this with that question, but that's at the heartbeat. Yeah, why would anyone want to learn from you and be in that space?
Thank you both. There's a sort of a logistical question that's come up, and one that I have as well. Colleen, when you said that you don't do a survey of board members' demographic identities or constituencies or relationships, how do you, and this is open to the whole panel, how do you balance between being that intrusive or worrying about tokenizing with making assumptions when sometimes organizations like Community Foundation want to know more about your diversity, and how do you even make the report you made about your leadership team without having that? Like, what's the means and the process and the mechanism by which you gather that important collective data, and how do you think about that balance, right? And there's no right answer here, but I'm sure we've all struggled, and people have a question about that in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of some of the demographics that I've shared, that's all voluntary information that has been given to us. And we do ask, for voluntary, filling out of surveys and stuff like that, but we don't require it. We don't require it. It's not part of our onboarding paperwork, anything like that. Because we understand that identities in many cases are fluid, and that, personal demographics are very personal. And even though we are an organization that is really, trying to focus on the well-being of people and being here for a different purpose and a different mission, we still recognize that many people are not used to that. And there's a mistrust of what management and enforcing of rules really leads to in terms of employment status, but also the confidentiality of information is sometimes abused. And I totally recognize that that's many people's experience, even though, we try to operate on, the best integrity that we can. So we do offer it up as voluntary information.
Thanks. Anyone else want to speak to that?
I'll just speak to that as well. As a financial institution, we are regulated and required to do a lot of reporting in a lot of different arenas, and we do make it a voluntary self-disclosure upon hire, and then we also send that out as a opportunity to update that every 2 to 3 years to existing employees. And the thought process behind that is hopefully if you didn't feel you were uncertain, right, as you're joining an organization, if I want to be vulnerable and I want to share with you that information or not, maybe I don't want to do that in my first week, right? But after 2 years of experiencing the culture of the organization and building relationships and seeing how you operate, I may begin now to feel more comfortable being vulnerable about my identity. I think the challenge with that is there's a story to be told when you have people who are choosing not to disclose, just as much as there's a story to be told when you have people choosing to disclose, right? And to me, the takeaway is we are also potentially not creating a space where people trust that that's not going to be used against them, or that they're not putting themselves in a vulnerable position. And I can share just kind of a very, very clear example. We ask people to self-identify if they are a veteran, right? And oftentimes that is a no when it comes through. It's fine. But then we do something that is an event recognizing and honoring veterans. And then we say, if you'd like, if you're a veteran and you want to participate, or you want to share your story, you want to come to this free coffee hour or what have you, they come out of the woodwork and they start to have just an amazing relationship, because they look around, they go, oh my gosh, there are 30 other veterans sitting around this table and we all get it, right? Like we speak the same language. And so that's just an example of how, right, you have to kind of figure out how do you make it safe for people to do that. But it goes back to something I think, George, you mentioned earlier, and I think Dr. Nunn, you mentioned it too, of connectivity, right? When I make a connection with somebody else and you're like me, I start to feel a different sense of belonging and a different level of relationship. So a long-winded way to say we do ask, we have to report in certain avenues, right? The New York State Banking Association really likes to know how we're serving in our communities. I just had to answer a questionnaire of, do we have multilingual speaking employees or people who speak a language that is in a community that we serve that is, a highly known Spanish speaking community? Are we doing the right thing in providing, right, employees in that community that can speak a language? And so we ask. It doesn't mean we always have the most accurate information, because if people aren't comfortable telling us, then, we may not be reporting appropriately. But those are some of the expectations, right, on banking, is that you are identifying the communities that you're serving and that you're putting people in those offices to be able to service appropriately, right, that audience. So
thank you, Stacie. There's even an interesting way of going about saying, we're asking these questions now. You might want to answer them now. You might want to answer them later. This is why we're asking these questions. How else can we create an environment where you might feel more safer and more open to answering these questions now? So you're engaging in the relational dialogue rather than just the transaction of filling that out, and creating a space where people can talk about that. And even when regulators require something, if you believe that requirement is off base or not needed or something, there's the concept of advocacy and lobbying with elected officials who create the rules. Just because they're the rules doesn't mean they need to stay the rules. So that's sort of an interesting kind of process to move forward on that.
So I just want to chime in and something really quick. So at the Community Foundation, we've taken it a step further. So there is no requirement for us to, gather data, and it's important to keep it optional. So it's not really a requirement. But we've given individuals the space to, instead of checking boxes, to identify themselves as they see themselves. So when I'm recruiting for like a review team, or we just recently, not recently, but last year, we did a poll of our board and just kind of asked them to describe themselves and you know, how they identify. And we got responses like, you know, animal lover, first generation US citizens. Some people describe themselves as a military brat or a preacher's kid, or even privileged, Jewish, like all these wonderful just identities that they're able to self-identify as, instead of checking off a box, the same boxes that are like, you know, ethnicity, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, you know, that sort of thing. So, right, just putting us into these boxes. So we've taken it a step further in giving people the opportunity to self-identify the way that they want to identify.
Thanks. We're set up today to go from 9 until 11, so we're kind of halfway through where we are. Mary, at some point, you'll let folks know how you're going to share with them information that's been shared at this gathering and what next steps might be. So just sort of take a midpoint breather, a little inhale and exhale. You are all amazing. I hope you're finding this helpful. I want to thank the panel for diving right into some really powerful conversations in a productive, constructive, powerful kind of a way. And we have more time together, and a reminder that you can continue to put comments and questions into the chat. I'd like to move to the next question, which is yours, Meghan. How far along the DEI journey do you feel that your organization, DEICC, is?
So this conversation kind of goes really nicely into the previous conversation. You know, as a nonprofit, we also are instructed by our regulators and then by some of our funders to dive into what our demographics are with our staff, with our board, and the families we serve. So tying that into this part of it, where do I feel like DICC is at in this journey? I think we're on the journey. I don't think there's actually an end point. I think we are at a point of humility, which I think is important because it adds that vulnerability piece that was discussed earlier. Knowing that you don't have to be right. There is no right, there is just. And that's really what we aim for, is to have that humility and to learn and to listen. We had a conversation yesterday about, okay, what is equitable for staff and what would be equitable for the families and children we serve. Sometimes those don't actually align when you're thinking about the resources that, you know, families, specifically families of color, need in order to have those kind of foundations for a child to feel safe, to feel like they are in a place where they can be vulnerable, you know, kind of like that hierarchy of needs. You know, there's more work that needs to go into those children because they're missing those foundations. However, in the safety of our staff, and their well-being, you know, do we send a child home for behavior? Where's the equity for both of them, for those, everything to be aligned together? And what I love about the team we have is, one of the first things that I ask when we have these conversations is, you know, what do I need to learn? What do I need to learn? Because I know I don't know everything. And I think that's one of the more dangerous positions to kind of be in, thinking that you know everything and that you are correct, that you are right, that your perspective is the only perspective. So, you know, as for where exactly we are on this continuum, I don't know. And I think that that's a good place to be, is to say, I don't know where we are, but I am willing to listen and learn. I don't think you have to have, I don't think there is a final destination. Because I think as inclusivity evolves and grows, we have to adapt with it.
Thank you. Next question, start with Stacie and then go to Gloria. We've sort of answered this a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper. How do you involve employees from underrepresented populations without making them feel tokenized? Talked a little bit about this, but this talks about action of the employer.
Yeah. You know, it's what I found really works best for us is focusing on connectivity and relationship building. Right from day one, right? Once you start to welcome a new person in, we're excited to have you here. Tell me a little about yourself, right? Like, what are you passionate about? What do you love? But really making each individual feel like they have a connection with their leader, with their HR team, with their, we assign them to either a coach or a mentor in the organization, right? Like that's just kind of embedded in that, start to make connections and build relationships. But, you know, from my seat in the work that I am really focused on is I reach out to every single new hire across our organization, introduce myself, my role, what's important, invite them to share their experience with me as far as what's it been like so far being a part of our organization, whether that's from the application phase straight through, you know, the interviewing phase to day one, you're here, boots on the ground. What does that look like? But being genuinely curious and invested in learning other people's perspectives, listening to learn, not listening to respond or dispute or dismiss. And it seems like a really simple thing, but it's amazing how often, right? If you have that lens on and you're watching for it, you see oftentimes that when people start to share a perspective that is different, perhaps than your own, there's that internal shift that starts to happen where your ears shut off a little bit and your mind starts really shifting gears into, I disagree with that. How do I respond to that and get my perspective on the table? So I think that's important, the listening piece, and allowing people to be involved in a lot of different ways, in the ways that's most meaningful and safe for them. Right, providing a variety of options for people to have a voice in our organization. So some people are comfortable only being vulnerable with their manager. They might only be comfortable having a one-on-one conversation with me because we've connected and they feel comfortable having that conversation with me about what their personal experience is and how does our environment create barriers or challenges for them that I'm blind to and I just don't know exist, right? Other people are only comfortable doing that in a group setting of either a group of diverse, you know, extremely diverse views and opinions and backgrounds at a table, and others are only comfortable doing it when they see other people like them sitting at the table and they feel like that's what makes me safe to share my voice. And then there's a whole other group, right, that strictly anonymous. Like, I don't want to be attached to this feedback. I am not, you know, either I have had an experience that has told me that doesn't end well, or I have a perception that that's not okay for me to be real and share my raw opinions. So we provide a lot of avenues for people to also provide their input where they can remain completely anonymous, but help contribute to our evolution, right, and our growth as an organization and contribute to our culture. So, you know, to me, though, the biggest thing is focusing on creating opportunities for connectivity and relationship building.
Thank you. Gloria, did you want to engage with this one as well?
Sure.
Yay.
So thank you, Stacie. I'm going to take it back just a little bit to talk about the definition because it's important that everyone understands what tokenism means. So it's the practice of making only a symbolic effort or a gesture, whatever we want to call it, to be inclusive to members of a minority group, especially by recruiting people from these underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of equality. So including an individual in work or school is usually intended to create this impression or this illusion, this pretty picture of diversity. So in order to avoid tokenism within the workplace, DEI and DEI programs, a platform must be integrated to foster an environment where people do feel connected and included. So the first thing to understand is that what represents this person, going back to the original question, what represents this person for your organization? Were they hired to just kind of check off a box, or are their unique abilities, talents, and traits valued, recognized, and acknowledged at your organization? Does that one person represent your BIPOC, female, LGBTQ, differently abled individual with dyslexia and a high school diploma? That one person. Token employees have higher visibility, considering they're often the only person like them in the room. And this really hinders them from being their true, authentic selves out of fear for how the majority or their counterparts or colleagues are going to perceive them. So think for a moment about how these employees feel. They literally represent an entire population to this organization or your organization, and that's a lot of pressure. And I know I showed this wheel a little earlier, but this is just a really cool graphic that I found that kind of shows a visual depiction of intersectionality, because intersectionality is really important in understanding tokenism. People aren't one-dimensional, we all know that. So having a good grasp of intersectionality in the workplace is critical and crucial. The concept is about how your social identities interact or intersect in various situations, resulting in being treated with privilege and or bias. So it kind of works in both ways. The idea is that the meaning of one social identity is dependent on other social identities, as well as the power and privilege or lack thereof for minorities afforded to these identities. When you enter into a room, we don't enter as just one social identity. You carry all of these social identities with you, whether they're visible or invisible to others. So your race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, religion, all of these things impact you. Sometimes that impact is direct and results in being treated with privilege or bias by others. Other times that impact is indirect. And this is the basis of intersectionality, because all of your social identities have an impact on how you and how others perceive and treat you. Individuals with multiple marginalized identities tend to be tokenized. So it's this specific group that tends to be tokenized. Intersectionality shows that different employees may need different degrees of support, resources, and systemic change to reach a space of equity. So even if they share the same marginalized social identity, creating a culture of equity and belonging in the workplace cannot come from a very broad change. It requires the specificity of intersectionality to be sustainable. And as a leader, you have enormous power to shape this. So you signal the values and behavioral standards that you want to embed in your team based on what you systemically pay attention to. So things like things that you notice, the things that you comment on, the things that you measure, the things that you control, and the things that you reward. So a couple tips. Don't pressure people to be a spokesperson for an entire community. Token employees are usually chosen to speak on behalf of other represented groups. Don't put that responsibility of one individual to educate others within the company about their race, culture, points of view as representative of the whole group. That's way too much pressure. Second thing, you want to allow diverse employees to be decision makers. So who do you have at the table? Who is making these decisions? So providing diverse employees a seat at the table is crucial. Allow them to not only be in the room when decisions are being made, but let them be part of those discussions. The other thing, which I think is the most important thing, is don't fake your diversity. One of the worst things that you can do is display this imagery of diverse teams on your website. We've all seen it, and social media platforms, when the actual makeup of your team doesn't reflect that at all. And it's okay to acknowledge that your team isn't diverse and that you're working on it. That's totally fine. Transparency about your DEI efforts goes a long, long, long way. The other thing is to become culturally competent. Take the time to learn about different cultures, races, religions, and backgrounds represented by your colleagues. That's one thing that we do definitely celebrate at the Community Foundation. We celebrate everybody's uniqueness just because it's a Thursday, we celebrate each other. That's how we do it at the Community Foundation. And I'm gonna just say a shameless plug that June is Caribbean Heritage Month. And because I'm Haitian, I'm going to be cooking a delicious meal for my staff in celebration of Heritage Month. And we do things like that all the time. And we don't even have to, none of our staff don't even have to be that particular culture. For example, I think one time we celebrated Irish Heritage Month, and we celebrated by cooking things green, and everything that we ate was green for that day. And doing things like that is really, really important. Communicate and educate, I'll say, is the last thing. Diversity work, it's a journey, not a destination. It takes time, it takes patience, and perseverance. Be tolerant of your coworkers who do not yet appreciate the value of diversity. They'll come along. They'll come along. Often negative behavior comes from ignorance rather than malice. Some people just really don't know. They just don't know better. And a willingness to educate can certainly go a long way.
Thank you, Gloria. And sometimes they won't come along, and sometimes they need to leave. And sometimes they'll leave on their own accord, and sometimes leadership needs to facilitate that departure. So those are not bad things. They can be challenging, painful, draining, times of self-reflection, but I think it's very important not to allow anyone to stop the DEI train from proceeding down the tracks that your organization wants to pursue it on. And there could be folks who take hostages or try to hold things up. You want to be careful about that. A lot of rich conversation, a lot of things for us to think about. This is why we're recording it. We're able to share information here. The next question that I wanted to share is, we'll start with Stacie and then go to Nia. What successful initiatives or best practices has your organization identified concerning diversity, equity, and inclusion issues?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to share is I think it's been 6 or 7 years that we've had a DEI steering committee established in our organization, and we've been focusing on really trying to drive this throughout our organization and making sure that we're advancing our journey. I think, as Meghan said, there's no end point. You never say, okay, we're here, our work is done. And sometimes it feels like you're starting at the beginning again. So just continuously staying focused, staying educated as a group, and making sure that we're embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout our workplace and our work practices. Our most recent focus that I've had has been on really conducting what I call a cultural audit of our organization. I think it was mentioned earlier, what's the business case, right? And different people speak different language. And in order to have the resources you need to be able to move things forward and to show that there's a gap and what those gaps are, sometimes you do need to use data and you do need to tell a story, and it helps you really set your goals. And so that's one thing. And one of the outcomes of that is we are in about the 3rd full year of having a completely employee-led diversity, inclusion, and belonging team. We call them an action team, and their goal is to take action. And they have 3 pillars that they focus on, and that's educating internally, educating their colleagues on all things diversity, inclusion, and belonging, empowering people to use their voice, to advocate, to be allies, to challenge the status quo, and engage people in the journey. This has been an incredible foundation for us that's helped really drive our efforts forward. The team has grown from 12 people to 25 in this 3-year window, which I think is a great testament to saying that they are having an impact, but they're doing it in a way that's bringing more people on board and excited to participate in having an impact. And that's a really positive thing. I'll just share, I think there's 3 things that I want to point out that they have remained focused on and have had an impact. One is an employee-driven podcast, which is about a 15-minute, they call it Coffee Break. And it's a conversation that provides a platform for people to share something about their experience, their uniqueness, what they're passionate about. It kind of, Gloria, made me think of your comment about you self-identify, like, tell us who you are, what you want to share about yourself. And that's kind of what this podcast does. But again, it goes back to driving that connectivity and humanizing people, right? Like, okay, we might have a certain role. So for example, one of our CEOs and presidents was on the podcast, and it was really intentional around humanizing her, right? As, hey, I'm a woman and I'm a mother and I'm, and she just shared those layers of identity of herself. And I think that it really changed the way people think about her, right? And what identity they attach to her. So that has been incredibly successful. It's hard to say how much has that actually contributed, right, overall, but I can say it's exciting and it's reassuring just knowing people love them. They talk about them all the time and they can never wait for the next one to come out. They drop like every 3 weeks or so, and people are just like, oh my God, did you hear the podcast of so-and-so? Like, you hear the buzz, and that to me is rewarding. They have also launched employee resource groups. Mm-hmm. And so right now we have 3 of them with 2 more on the horizon to come along. And again, this has been a really great forum for helping people connect, feel a greater sense of belonging in our organization. Oh, there's other people that are, and I'll just share kind of our caregivers ERG has been, I would say, one of the most robust rooms of discussion. And when I say room, we do it as a WebEx so people can participate from wherever they are. But the connectivity and the relationship building that's happening and the support of each other, it creates a forum for that to happen in our organization that never existed before, right? We have an employee in Pennsylvania that's talking to an employee in Buffalo, right? That interaction would have never been possible otherwise. So it's really a beautiful thing. And you just see people having a different mindset when they go through these programs or participate. The other piece is monthly education. So every month they focus on celebrating all of the cultural celebrations that are recognized in that month. So they provide education around each of those. We kind of follow a predefined calendar of these celebrations because we don't all know what they all are. So we had to really educate ourselves. This month they're hosting a virtual Pride Walk, but they've also done book clubs. So if it's around a very specific topic, so it was about, for example, incarcerated individuals. that are coming back into the world, right? Back into the mainstream, and how difficult that is. So, or being wrongfully accused. So they did a book club around that, and picked a book that was very much, something that they could all talk about, what their takeaways were. It was a safe environment to do that, and that was really powerful. And then something really fun, right? Like, hey, it's summertime. Submit to us your favorite summer song and tell us why it's your favorite. And it was like music from around the world, right? Like, and we put together a playlist and we published it for our employees. And then again, it was just this like, oh my gosh, I love that song too, or I'd never heard that song before and I just fell in love with it, or whatever. It just created that connection and conversation. So, a lot of things, but I think that staying focused on creating an experience for people that helps them feel like they belong in our internal community as well as our external community. And so we've recently also launched our DIBS team, our DIBS action team is focused internal, and we've recently launched what we call our Acorn Community Alliance. Acorn is as a result of our logo, for anybody who doesn't know that. Acorn and Oak Leaves. And this group has been together for just about 8 months. And their focus is in doing a lot of the same things, but in our communities. So financial education in the community, financial support in the community to help organizations advance and have the support they need. And then volunteerism, that's something that's core to our organization, our culture. But really diversifying that volunteerism, right? You have a lot of places where you just continue to give money to the same places over and over again because they're the ones coming to the table. But what are we doing to intentionally invite diverse organizations, underserved organizations, or organizations serving underserved populations to the table to say, hey, we want you to come and tell us what you need. We want to know what you need. We want to know how we can help. So that group is doing some really great groundwork right now to help us identify some of those areas in our communities. So we're pretty excited about that.
Thanks, Stacie. Those are some very concrete logistical steps that your organization, your employer is taking. Nia?
Yes, I'm happy to share and give you a bit of information about a few concrete exercises that I've found to be beneficial in a variety of locations where I am engaging folks in this work. And so really what I'm offering are some of the pieces of radical vulnerability, this curriculum essentially that I've been teaching forever and I'm writing about now. But it begins actually, George, with how you began and how you paused us in the middle. And it's with breathing. A breath. How often in your organizations have you sat still at the beginning of your meetings and took a breath together? Throw on some music and literally just breathe. If it's a moment, 2 moments. And so with radical vulnerability, I like to engage people in some writing afterward. What was it like? Were you able to concentrate? Were you able to zap in? And just tuning into that collective breath and journey as a regular practice. I know it's tiny, but it can be transformative in how we be with each other, even heal with each other when that time is necessary. The other initiative that is a thread through Ithaca College, Southside, CMEP, for me is actually poetry. The vulnerability that comes through poetry. So 3 offerings for you. I am poetry. Now I know this may seem elementary. We do it with our pre-K, our kindergartners, our 5th graders, and all the way through up high school. But I have found this to be powerful with grownups. Taking time to sit there and name, and a lot of folks have alluded to this, but thinking about various characteristics. You might have a page of words or have people identify their own words. But I like to, even grownups, engage folks in an exercise where you identify characteristics that describe who you actually are, and then ideal characteristics, and going ahead and reading that poetry to each other. So 1, it allows for a little bit of honest conversation about public speaking, but then that vulnerability around naming your strengths and your characteristics, like that in a workspace, I have found to be transformative. The second one, there are 3. The second one is where I'm from poems. Yes, those good old where I'm from poems are everything. One, I love to send people off to engage in an exercise. There are some structures out there, but engage in an exercise in writing that poetry and coming back. We spend time reflecting on what our relationship is with writing, our various relationships, and where we were even when we wrote the poem. But I find that when everybody, and especially in spaces where people are like, oh, I'm not a creative writer, or I'm not very artistic, those are my favorite spaces. And because when you have an opportunity to unpack and play around with some of the depth of like the snacks you ate, the songs that you sang as a child, the sayings that your grandmother said, like, and bringing in those various elements of who you are and where you're from, sharing that is transformative. Doing that work in corporate spaces or organizations that don't usually allow themselves to get real mushy I found it to be transformative. I have found that people have been working with each other, sometimes for years, 5, 10 years, and didn't know, you know, some tiny, oh, you grew up on the beach too? Oh, you ate Oreo cookies? Like just those exercises that have us unpacking and sharing who we are that bring us together is just absolutely transformative. The third exercise, the poetry piece, is for my people poems. For my people. Right? Because similarly to what we've been talking about, it gives folks an opportunity to identify themselves, to name their collectivity, right? So I've written various For My People poems, some that really center Black women, but also center that Black woman, quirky, artistic, and all these other elements that make a collective around me. I love the poems that come from people about, growing up with ADHD, growing up with, and writing a For My People poem can be healing to share in a collective space. So I just offer those little pieces of some of the radical vulnerability work that I have done for years with children, but these last couple years, I found it to be transformative with adults. So I guess the ultimate initiative or best practice is to welcome and bring some of your childhood self into your workspaces. I mean, what that allows in terms of this realm of radical vulnerability, I have found to be absolutely transformative. So breathing together, some I am poetry, where I'm from and for my people. And so that can be a beautiful part of a collective self-study. And so that's my offering in terms of an initiative.
What a beautiful offering it is. Can I ask you to get a little more specific? You mentioned a few times transformations. Can you be a little more specific about what type of transformations that you're seeing specifically in the workplace with adults?
Yeah, I have found people express a shift in thinking. Right? So, okay, I'll give you a concrete example. I do another exercise around labeling. Right? And I ask everybody has like a Post-it and you have 1 minute. Many people do exercises like this, but 1 minute to write all of your labels, all of your, and we're talking about social identity, but all of your labels in 1 minute, go as fast as you can. We should have just done the exercise right now. And then I stop and have everybody take a look at it. There's all the anxiety about that speed and whatever, and everybody is worrying about whether they did it right or did it wrong and all of that. And then I ask a series of questions. I say, how many of you identified your gender, right? How many of you identified your race? How many of you identified your religion? How many of you identified your sexuality? How many of you identify, right? And we go on and on to list. I say, how many of you identified yourself as able-bodied or you named a specific condition? And lo and behold, everybody can get sort of stressed out about what they didn't name and unpacking that and all of it. But even that concept of reflecting on what we name and what we don't name, I have found people have a shift in thinking as part of that process. How many of you identify more of a sort of a dominant characteristic or a subordinate characteristic in our society? And what is that about? Where does that come from? How often you can walk into a space. I walk into a space where I am deemed, a racial minority or what have you, and I notice, right? How many of you walk into a space, if we're talking about race, and you identify as white, and you walk and you say, and notice that it is an entire white space. But can you be a person who's deemed able-bodied and walk into a space and notice and pay attention? So I give a little bit of that just to say that's an example of a transformation, about having the ability to walk into a space and pay attention and notice. And sometimes that takes practice, and that's the transformation.
Powerful. Thank you so much. And then that shift of thinking, we become more creative, more problem solving. We achieve the goals that we want to achieve for ourselves and for our organizations, for our clients, for our customers, for our children. Very, 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 very powerful. We did have one comment quickly in the chat, just to bring attention to the intersectionality wheel. People were asking about, well, let's see, I don't see age on there, or I don't see spiritual practice on there. So this is a great way of deepening our understanding of all these multiple identities and a shift in thinking. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of comment about that. We have two more formal questions. We have a little more time after that. And I want to really thank people for committing your time to be with us today, your intention about how you take what you've learned here and move things forward. And certainly thank our five panelists who are just have huge amounts of tools and tricks and in the best sense of that word, and wonderful things to do and practices and sharing so generously with us. For Stacie, what would you say is the most difficult part of implementing a DEI program? That's one of our last two questions.
Yeah. If you'd asked me a couple years ago, I probably would have had a little bit of a different answer, but I think Meghan might touch about the getting started piece in a minute. But I think the most difficult part, at least at this point in where I sit, is continuing to remember that everybody is at a different point in their DEI journey as an individual, right? And you have some people that haven't started, and you have others that have that are the the pacemakers, right? They are on the other end of the spectrum of really advanced. And I think the challenge with that is, for some people, we're not doing enough, and we're not doing it fast enough, and we're not having a big enough impact in a short enough period of time. And for other people, you're going too fast, and you're causing some unintended consequences of people feeling like this is just being forced upon them, or they're feeling a little threatened or fearful, right? Like there's all of these things that kind of contribute to that response of like, whoa, hold on. And I think when it comes down to it, what I try to explain to people is that the work that we are doing, one of the outcomes is that people get uncomfortable. And when you get uncomfortable, a lot of other things take over, right? You can't necessarily help people with every piece of that. But my motto has been that my goal is to get people comfortable being uncomfortable, and creating the space and expectation that we might have an uncomfortable conversation. It may make some of you question those early childhood values or experiences, and there's just so much, right, that is uncomfortable about it, because that self-discovery piece comes into play. And whenever it's a lot easier to point the finger, right, and say, well, they are the problem, or that is the problem. But what I try to remind people is that we need to also look at those three fingers that point back at us and say, well, what role am I playing? How am I contributing? And what could I do different? And what am I not doing that I should be aware of? So, I think for me, that's the piece is, recognizing I am where I am in my journey, and it hasn't always been where I am today. And also, and George, I think you said it, recognizing the difference between somebody is at the beginning or the I haven't started part of their journey, and how do you help them take those initial steps? But also, when do you identify they just don't want to? And you can't force, right? I can't force somebody to change. And we shouldn't force people to change, right? You are who you are. If we want to be our authentic selves, right, then that is it. But that authentic self may not always fit in that organization and what they're valuing, right? So it's being able to recognize that and deal with it when it comes up as well. And I think that's really difficult to do and still honor that person's uniqueness and their own identity and what they feel is true and meaningful to them and important. So it's creating space for people to feel. And I love that you have said, radical vulnerability. I think, vulnerable, I talk about all the time. And, I'll just share a very quick example of a pay equity conversation that we were having. And a male at that table started challenging a female's gap in her resume. And I was in a space where I was willing to be vulnerable and say, very point blank, would we be having this conversation if this were a male's resume? Is there any possibility that that gap in that female's resume is because the 3 years they weren't reporting working anywhere? They may have birthed a child or adopted a child or, right? Let's think about this, people, right? But I will say there are other spaces, right, where I would not have been as comfortable to use my voice perhaps that powerfully. So again, it relied back on the relationships that I've established with the people takes a lot of vulnerability, I think, to be the only female at a table and say, you know what, mentally, I've just had it. And I am not going to sit here saying this to myself and not say it out loud, right? That's what you're paying me for. You are paying me to challenge you, right? Like, so that's what I'm going to do. But it's hard to do that. And it's hard to do it, whether it's because you're the only female in the room, it's because you're the only Black person in the room, it's because you're the only, right? It's hard, but it takes courage and vulnerability and an intentional commitment to say, it's my responsibility to help us advance in this journey. And I can't let opportunities like that slip by, right? Even if perhaps the moment was the wrong audience for me to feel comfortable using my voice, how do I bring it back to the table at a later place where it's appropriate to do so? So, so those are the things for me. And the other big piece that I think is so important to touch on is, and I imagine others will agree, the work in this space, the advocacy, the vulnerability, the constant monitoring of how do I relay a message that can be heard in a way I intend it and has the right impact. It's exhausting, right? You can get really tired. And the people that are doing this work can get tired. So it's constantly having a pulse as well, right? My DIBS action team, constantly pulse checking, like how are they doing, right? Taking them for a cup of coffee. What are you most excited about? And I can tell when their energy changes, they're tired, or they have interacted with someone who has demeaned or diminished the work that they're doing, or has a differing opinion of, God, I don't know why we're wasting time on a pride walk. I'm not saying anybody has said that, right? But I'm just saying that these are the little statements that they encounter, right? And they have put passion and time and energy and effort into doing this. And to hear a little comment like that is a very big comment, and it's very impactful. And so how do you help people take a step back, recharge, redirect, shift mindset, return to course, right? Don't give up. Give them the support that they need. You can't just put people out there and say, good luck, right? Best of luck to you. And also help them see the progress. It can be really hard to feel like you've made a difference. And so we spend a lot of time celebrating our accomplishments, and, you know, taking inventory of what are all the things that you guys did in this last quarter. Wow, when you put that on a PowerPoint slide and you share it with the world, right? Like that is a moment to say, that's a lot of work. We did a lot of work. And the other thing I like to keep a focus on is reminding people that you don't always know the impact that you've had, right? You may have, you know, a book club, and somebody may not say to you, this was life-changing to me, or this just did so much for me, right? Or this is how I'm going to go out into the world and be different. But at the same time, you have to believe that the work that you're doing is having those silent impact moments around for people, even though it's not being verbalized, right? And there's no measure to be able to say, okay, the impact of that was, you know, a revenue dollar, or it was a specific metric that you can look at. Sometimes that impact is internalized for people and they don't share that. So, you know, while the work is never done, the effort is also never a waste of time, energy, and effort, but you've got to make sure that that stays somewhere built into your process, because you can lose sight or feel like you're not making progress, I think, so easily. And you just feel like, why am I wasting my time? Or is this really valued in the organization? So I think that's been something that, you know, it's difficult in the sense that you have to have the intention of thinking about these things all the time, right? Like you can't set it and forget it. That's not a thing.
Discipline and a commitment, right?
Yeah.
Stacie, thank you. I want to alert the panel. The last question we have, I want to give everyone an opportunity to kind of respond to, which is, what advice do you have for those who want to be DEI advocates and aren't sure how to start? So be thinking about that. These comments to maybe also think how important it is to set a culture of responsibility without blame or shame, right? So that we are all responsible for doing this work. It's not this one staff person or this one group. It's infused across all parts of the organization, the employer, the entity. And we are responsible, no matter our intention, we're also incredibly responsible for our impact, right? Good intentions can cause harm, trauma, negative impact, hurt. And we're not saying that we're ever going to be perfect in this work. There'll be times when we make mistakes. What happens when we make a mistake and our impact is not what our goal and our intention is take responsibility for it, receive it in a non-defensive way, learn from it, figure out how to repair whatever damage happened, and rededicate yourself to doing this kind of work, right? I think it's really important that we don't get stuck in the huge potholes of blame and shame and guilt, right? Guilt says, I did something I wasn't supposed to do, or I didn't do something I should have done. Shame says, I am bad, right? Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about identity and our self-concept. I think it's really important for us to find the balance point of taking responsibility without falling into the paralyzing and somewhat self-serving position of feeling guilty or feeling shame, because that doesn't advance the work that we do. So how do we normalize that kind of stuff? So as we begin to move toward wrapping up this session, I'm sure the chamber will continue to do this work because they understand as an organization, it is a lifelong commitment. I wanted to thank everyone for being here and thank our panelists for sharing incredibly insightful, positive, productive, constructive resources, concept maps, relationships, tools that are very concrete and specific. And I know that everyone on the panel is welcoming of additional contact and conversations because you've shared so much. And as we begin to wrap up, I want to give everyone on the panel an opportunity to answer the question of what advice do you have for those who want to be DEI advocates and aren't sure how to start. So I will give you a chance to think about that for a minute. Mary, are there any last minute housekeeping things as we wrap up here? Any information you want to share from the chamber's perspective?
No, just want to thank everyone, just like you had said, George, but of course I want to also thank you for your excellent job facilitating. We are so grateful that you also, volunteered your time to, really kind of spearhead this conversation. So thank you so much. And then of course, I just want to always give a shout out to our sponsors when we can. So once again, thank you to Cayuga Health System, Tompkins Community Bank, Community Foundation of Tompkins County, Borg Warner, and Chemung Canal Trust Company for their amazing support. And as we continue to build this series for another round, always open for feedback, ideas, anything like that. So feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, Mary. And what's the best way for folks to reach out? Directly to you by email? Put that
Yeah, I'll drop my email in the chat.
So wonderfully beloved panelist, smart, kind.
Wow, too much, George, too much.
No, it's true. It's true. Is there someone who'd like to begin advice at this point? I'm going to call on each one of you.
Sure, I'll start. So I am I love the work of Brene Brown, and her work is something that I feel like is just, I don't know, I just really resonate with it. And I think the one thing that she I've heard her say, and that just screams in my head every time I am battling my own fear of taking a next step or doing the next thing and advancing whatever it is take a deep breath and take a leap. And just, you just have to start. Like, you just have to mentally try to get yourself in a place where you're accepting that it's not going to be perfect. But it's going to be something, and you're going to learn from those somethings. And so for me, I continue to say, take a deep breath and take a leap. That for me is really powerful. So that would be my departing advice.
Thank you, Stacie. Who'd like to speak next?
I'll chime in next.
Meghan.
What I think is really interesting, I didn't share this at the beginning, but I actually have worked with Stacie on DEI practices within a board that she was working on. So for me to see where she's taken her organization and whatnot, it's really beautiful to see. So keep it up, Stacie. And one of the parts that she had kind of touched on was like humility. And that was the training that we did. It was cultural humility. It's the idea of like building blocks, thinking about cultural competency, and really to be competent in knowing about an entire culture. It's like an iceberg. You have the things at the top that you can see, like foods, parades, things along those ends. But then there's so much more, how people communicate with each other, how people actually, their tone of voice. There's so much that goes into it, which is why I'm such an advocate for humility, having that cultural humility. And as we kind of hinted on too, DEI isn't about perfection. It's about that continuum of learning, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because in that uncomfortable place is where change happens. As an educator, I was always so happy with mistakes, because that's where we learn, is when we make mistakes. And then in thinking of building blocks, I think about when folks say advocacy, I think of kind of 3 building blocks. I think of an ally, I'm here, I value you. I think of somebody who's an advocate. I'm here, I value you, and I will use my voice to help amplify and make changes and create space so that you can use your voice to make changes. And then for me, the ultimate building block is the accomplice. It's the ally. I'm here, I value you. It's the advocate. I will use my voice to help advocate and make changes. And then the accomplice is holding systems accountable for making those changes. So when I think of folks who want to start out with advocacy, start with allyship, and build up that trust within systems. Somebody had posted a comment in the chat regarding refugees. How can we talk to them to have them share their story? And the truth is, you really don't. You create that trust within them so that when they're ready to share, they share. Because we want folks, as somebody who works with a lot of refugees, I'm not just going to go up to a stranger, tell me your life story. How can I make this better for you? It's creating that space so that when they're ready, they will share it because you have created that space for them. You are an ally, you're an advocate, and they see that you're going to be an accomplice. So that's my thoughts about advocacy with DEI.
Thank you, Meghan. See Nia unmuting.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I did have a little video clip I wanted to share with you all, but I'll leave that alone and just say that I really encourage folks to listen to the children. And zapping into the babies. I'm sorry, like I can do this and this is great and I so appreciate this, but my real audience are 300 to 400 children at a time. And so when you talk about vulnerability, especially this radical vulnerability that I am presenting to so many folks, like we just have to listen to our babies. They are ready. They are ready, they're eager. And I say that to also encourage the reflection of our own childhood and the childhood selves that we are still healing and navigating. So I think that is the beginning. It begins with that sense of self-love that I know that we are witnessing and encouraging in our children. So I think that's the core send-off as it relates to serving as an advocate. Listen to the babies. They have so much to say, and they're ready, above and beyond ready. So I serve as a vessel, as a tool for amplifying their voices, making sure that we pass the microphone to them. I think that's the real DEI advocacy that will lead to the transformation that's necessary. So yeah, zap into these babies.
Well, that very powerfully resonates with me. Thank you, Nia, for saying that.
I just want to chime in really quick and say that diversity fatigue is real, like DEI fatigue is real. The topic is everywhere. And people are tired of talking about it. Don't get frustrated by all this discussion not turning into meaningful action. It's a fight. It's a fight that takes resources and energy, and it's hard to stay committed when you're barely seeing results or you feel like you're, in the same space. That's when you see interest and passion, advocacy getting slowly transformed into passivity and kind of tuning out and just saying, okay, well, I can't do this. The sheer number of issues that need to be addressed is daunting for a lot of people. For a lot of people that do this work, from sexism, ableism, ageism, which was mentioned in the chat earlier. The fight for DEI is a battle on so many different fronts, and matters can be complicated further by internal disagreements on what to focus on. So if there is no chief diversity officer, it's like, well, what do you focus on first? There's so many different things to do, and trying to address them all at once is obviously not a recipe for success. And, people don't know where to start. And the feeling that you can't make an impact as just one person or just one organization can lead to you stop taking action altogether. So I just say, be encouraged. Don't give up, like Nike, just do it kind of thing, and get with other advocates. get with other people that are like-minded, get with people that are doing this work and have seen success or have been in this space for a while. You know, this is and like I said in the beginning, I'm novice, I'm new, I'm the rookie. I've only been in this space for about a year. And I learned from, you know, people like the Stacies and the Colleens and the Nias and the Ken Clarks and the you know, Shelley Michelle Nunns and all of these wonderful people. I learn from them and I absorb, you know, not just the information that they're giving, but their energy as well. They energize me. So that's what I want to say about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Colleen, did you want to speak to this?
Definitely don't want to be the one to have the last word, so it's not my style. But yeah, I mean, just reiterating what everyone else said. Believe people when they're telling you there's unconscious bias in the world, that they're feeling microaggressions, that, you know, they're feeling marginalized. Don't believe people who say, you know, woke culture is ruining America. I think we're going to be in this fight for a really long time, and you just have to believe people and fight against the people that are refusing to believe in it. That's got to be priority number one for the children. Believe them.
Thank you. I am so appreciative. You have all energized me today, and I, with great admiration and respect and appreciation and awe, thank our panel who provided so much information to us. Here is your call to action. Here's the last word. Between now and the time you go to bed tonight, whenever that might be, talk to one person in your social, family, neighborhood, work network, and share one thing you learned today here at this, and one thing that learning might lead you to do. So an awareness, a learning, a new piece of information, and how that might have motivated with you. Share that, because this work is relational, it's powerful, and it is continual. And I'm so glad that I have on my personal journey so many fellow travelers to do this work with. Thank you, and have a wonderful, blessed day.
Thank you, everyone.